everyone to the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network live stream that we do traditionally at the COP, Global Voices and Women-Led Calls to Action in response to COP30. I am going to give some opening remarks, but we're very, very honored right now to have Susanna Mohammed join us, and she's only got a few minutes. She's a foreign minister of the environment, and she's also a special envoy to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. We've been very honored to have her on a press conference this week. You're welcome to listen to that. But right now, we want to hear from Susanna about her take on the COP and the stage that we're at right now and her few minutes that she has with us. You have the floor, Susanna Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I am so happy to be here with this process we've been working, and thank you for opening these spaces. I think that the COP has been a bit of a confusing COP. It started with some aims and politically developed other aims, which is good because this is a democratic process. Now what is at the center is the roadmap for phasing out fossil fuels. But at the end, you know how this process works. And for the audience that is hearing us, it seems to be that it could be like not allowing, we can see it, the glass half full or half empty. And I will see that I will talk about both perspectives. The roadmap, actually, what they want is to give the presidency the mandate to develop a roadmap and a process. So it's more actually the attempt of 80 countries that the phase out doesn't track back. Remember that in 2023 in Dubai, it got approved with all the countries that we're going to transition away, but there is a backlash of countries that are saying, no, that's not valid anymore. So the roadmap is a response to say, no, we're going to continue working on that, and it's like a signal. In this moment where we have governments like the United States that has pulled out of the COP, and we have many regimes that are going deeply into the fossil fuel era, the glass half full will be that this is a signal that the world will not be going in that line. Now, the glass half empty is that it will not have any substance. It will not talk about anything concrete. And basically, it's just a way to keep this issue alive, which means deeply at the end that what we're talking about in these COPs is that we need, basically what's happening is that the fossil fuels, capital, industry, and states keep fighting against moving forward in climate change. And the outcomes of the COP at the end are trying to keep alive the 1.5. So it's a survival. COPs are survival, where actually fossil fuels are dominating the potential of the decisions. As an ambassador now for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, I think that's unacceptable and is far from solving the issue of climate change, or for at least going to the aim of having humanity in secure environmental limits in the 21st century. And that's why we have to continue working with this process, but not limiting ourselves to this process. So just before the accident that happened today at COP, that has all the negotiations suspended, Colombia was going to announce a conference in April so that countries that are really willing to phase out fossil fuels could join together to talk about the real difficulties of this transition and the real issues that are not talked here, because the COPs have become more a defensive process against the fossil fuel industry. Finally, it's also stock adaptation finance, which is critical for developing countries. And we could say something that just talks about the times we are in, that the gender program and declaration has a big backlash by 4 or 5 countries: the Vatican, Paraguay, Argentina, the Arabs, around going back to a definition of binary gender that is actually unacceptable, but talks about the political realities in our world where democracies, freedom, and this fossil fuel capital that is taking over governments is pushing humanity towards not only unsafe limits, but actually authoritarianism and war. And so I call back to all the people to resist, to work together, to build alternatives, and that we can meet in Colombia to start to continue walking the path of hope, but the hope that is produced because we act and because we send signals of change. And this is in a very difficult world, but I will summarize like that. This COP, as I said in the press conference, the most important image of this COP has been the indigenous people storming into the COP from the Amazon. We are in their territory. There's not a single talk on the deforestation roadmap while we are in the Amazon. So yes, my voice is critical, but the COP is in a survival mood. And the best we can hope is that we have a signal that we will continue working on fossil fuels phase out, and that's a signal that the world, or at least part of the world, will stand up against authoritarianism. Thank you very much, Ashley.
Thank you. I'm Osprey, by the way, but that's okay. Just for our audience, just so they're not confused. Thank you so much, Susanna.
Sorry.
That's okay. Hey, it's plenty fine. All of us are on no sleep, no eating. I get it. I just wanted to make sure we didn't confuse our audience. Thank you so much, Susanna Mohammed. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for taking a few moments with us for your really critical analysis. And we are here to lift up your voice and support you in the work that you're doing. And we look forward to being with you in Colombia, especially. So thank you very much. And I know you've got to go. And I'm going to introduce Sapor Berman in a moment, but I did want to now welcome everyone. We had to sort of quickly bring Susanna on because she was on her way between meetings. We are here at COP30 in Belém, Brazil. Today is Thursday, and there is a few more days. My guess is that COP will leak over until Saturday. What Susanna was referring to is Catherine Quaid from our team, our communications director, myself, have literally just left COP30 early today. You might have seen on some of the social media posts, there was a fire, a big fire in the pavilion and one of the pavilion areas. And so everyone was evacuated out of the blue zone. And at this point, we won't know what is exactly going to happen until about 8 o'clock tonight, Brazil time. So the negotiations are not continuing right now, and it's at a critical time. So I'm sure there's a lot of conversation with the Brazilian government, with the presidency and the UNFCCC about how to manage the situation, because we're really at the most intense moment of the negotiations. So we're all regrouping at this stage. We don't think anyone was severely harmed, but we do know some of our dear colleagues were in that space and their lungs were hurt. So we're also trying to double task here and make sure that everyone that we can support and help at this moment, that we are able to do that. But we wanted to go forward with this live stream because it's important also that people know what's going on. I'm just going to make a few comments also contextually and then hand the floor to Zipporah. Is as Susanna said, like, we're in the Amazon, and you've been hearing this all week, how hard it was fought for to bring this COP to the Amazon. And it must be recognized that the Amazon is at a tipping point. All of the indigenous leaders we've met with are screaming at the top of their lungs that we must protect the Amazon. And remember that this is important for all of us. The Amazon is responsible for so much of our weather patterns, of the rains and water that we see around the world. So it's particularly important to defend and protect the Amazon for the indigenous peoples who are the stewards and custodians of these lands, but also for all of us. So there's been a huge collective effort to protect and bring attention to the Amazon. And unfortunately, that message has not been strong enough inside the hallways of the COP. And as Susanna mentioned, there's been two direct actions led by indigenous people working to get into the COP and making a statement and really strongly, as they should be, protesting. Unfortunately, we're in a democratic country where those protests are legal to do, peaceful protests, but it has caused there to be a very severe ratcheting up of a military presence here. We just posted about that on our social media channels if you're interested about that, and the intimidation to frontline communities, the intimidation and to Indigenous peoples and civil society with this increase of militarization. I do want to also mention that there have been over 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists here. So there is just a huge influx, as there has been over the years, of the influence of the fossil fuel industry. And we've been with many partners saying, polluters out, Indigenous people in. That's what needs to happen here. And it hasn't been happening. So it's something we're going to continue to fight for. And then I will contextualize one other piece, which is what happened during some of these negotiations is that the COP presidency put together something that is sort of outside of the normal agenda, to put items that were big items and to be able to have time and space for them. And so one of those is this roadmap for a fossil fuel phase out. And a few days ago, what happened is that there was a big press conference led by the Marshall Islands, but supported by 80 countries to really keep this momentum towards a fossil fuel phase out alive here at the COP. There was some initial draft text put out about that. And one of the big things that's happening here at COP30 today is that we're looking for the next round of a draft text on all the negotiations and also on this phase out piece that is still being negotiated and discussed. I think that the other things that has been really important is that there has been some big announcements of Indigenous rights and demarcation of lands in Brazil. Some big announcements on different territories happened here, which was very good. And I'm sure Zipporah will talk about this, but we're really excited about the fact that this week Cambodia signed on to the Fossil Fuel Treaty. We were very excited about going to the press conference today, where Colombia was going to speak about the conference next year, where countries will be gathering to discuss the treaty and work on that mechanism. And I'm going to hand over to Zipporah to talk more about that. But that press conference didn't happen because of the fire. And so hopefully some of these things that were planned for today, including the People's Plenary, hopefully will be pushed to tomorrow or later tonight. We don't know yet. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. I have some other date updates, but while have Zipporah here, I want to hand her the floor. Zipporah Berman, she is the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. She's from Canada, and WECAN is very, very honored to sit on the steering committee of the treaty, which has had a really fantastic presence here. Zipporah, you have the floor. We're so honored you're here. Thank you.
Hi, Osprey. Thank you for having me and for all of WECAN's great work at COP and beyond. I think you and Susanna have really set the stage for, to update people on what's happening at COP30. Let me see if I can add some texture to it and information. As you said, today, Colombia had a big press conference planned to go through details of the conference that they're planning. And that we will be working to support them in. To be clear, the conference is a fossil fuel phase out conference, and it's historic because it will be the first diplomatic conference in the world on fossil fuel phase out and outside of the UN system. So why is that important? Historically, when you look at other really key intransigent issues that haven't been able to move forward inside the UN system because there are some countries that really stand to benefit from maintaining the status quo and kind of fight against progress. In many of those circumstances, like landmines, Canada hosted the Ottawa Convention outside the UN process. It was a kind of build it and they will come model, and that set the stage for and the development of the landmine treaty. So this conference on fossil fuel phase out that will be in Santa Marta in the end of April, that Colombia is hosting, is a really, I think, historic moment. And it's not a fossil fuel treaty conference. It's a fossil fuel phase out conference. There will be many more countries there than the ones who are participating at the table to develop a treaty, but the fossil fuel treaty will be one track of it. And we hope that it will set the stage for formal treaty negotiations to begin by the end of 2026 or 2027. Let me back up a minute and talk about what's happening here at COP30, because I know folks are really interested in that and build the bridge to that conference. Right at the beginning of COP30, President Lula set the stage for fossil fuel phase out and the need for a roadmap of fossil fuel phase out to be a priority of COP. That was important. It was a political signal, and the first time that a COP president has ever given that signal. And I think for those of us who have been, working on the front lines against fossil fuel projects in impacted communities, indigenous leaders, the entire WECAN network, you sometimes you forget along the road to celebrate your victories. That in itself is a victory. For many of us, there was 26 COPs where the words fossil fuels were never even uttered. And if you talked about fossil fuels, you were kind of looked at like you were crazy. I actually remember, Oscar, the Bali COP. I don't even remember when that was. I don't know, 20 years ago. And I had brought with me a hockey bag full of books about the tar sands in Canada because I'm Canadian and I wanted to raise awareness about the tar sands. And I'm handing out these tar sands books to anyone who would talk to me, and trying to make the connection between oil development and the climate negotiations. And the number of people, okay, let me just say men, who tried to mansplain climate policy to me, literally, oh dear, you don't understand. We're allowed to continue to expand oil production. This is just about emissions. And there was for so many years, this complete disconnect between fossil fuel production and fossil fuels. I was even told it was rude that I kept bringing up oil drilling at a climate conference. That's not the issue here. And so to have the fossil fuel phase out as the predominant conversation in COP, that in itself is a victory. As Susanna Mohammed said, having 80 countries supporting the transition away from fossil fuels, or what's become known here as the TAF, there's always many acronyms, is also a strong political sign, as is the Columbia Declaration. The difference between them is that the Columbia Declaration is quite a bit stronger than what's being considered underneath the TAF. But neither of them is enough. Declarations and statements are not enough. So we have a range of political leaders making some vague statements about ambition. If you look back in history to social movement theory, this moment where they take your language and co-opt it and even use it with a sense of urgency, yes, we need a roadmap. The current roadmap text is a plan to talk about making a roadmap in the future. There's no timelines. There's no commitment to ensuring that roadmap aligns with 1.5. There's no set dates. And so we have to be careful of this moment, right? Because we want them to be talking about fossil fuels, and we need that dialogue inside COP and outside COP. But we have to be very careful that we don't just accept it, and their framing of the conversation. So to make an actual phase out of fossil fuels possible, we need actionable ambition. And the only way COP30 can do this is by adopting a formal decision to launch a process for a global line map in line with equity and in line with the science of 1.5. And those words have been taken out of the roadmap at this point. So I do believe that the first international conference on fossil fuel phase out, to be held in Colombia in April 2026, will be the next big step in creating a real roadmap that has timelines and commitments, that is more akin to what the people in the streets of Belém have been calling for. It will really provide a platform for countries to discuss how to cooperate. And this is a critical point. When you see those 80 countries saying, yes, we support fossil fuel phase out, and not supporting a roadmap like a fossil fuel treaty, in part, it's because they believe that countries should just do it on their own. If they're going to address fossil fuel production, it should be through national policy or through new technologies and market-driven processes. What's different about the fossil fuel treaty and that work and the work of the Columbia Conference is it's a recognition that we need international cooperation, new global governance mechanisms to address growing debt, tax, and trade agreements, real financial cooperation to help countries stop expanding fossil fuels that is built on equity. And obviously the draft text we have so far from COP have no mention of equity, ambition, or real action. We also critically need progress on adaptation and finance. And so I think I might just end with a couple of pieces on the just transition frameworks, because again, we're seeing a real battle between the North and the South emerge at COP30. And I think it's one of the central battles between what's known as the Just Transition Action Plan, the JTAP, and the BAM. So the G77 and China have formally proposed the Belém Action Mechanism. And this is a new funded body to manage a global just transition. But in response, the EU has tabled a weaker just transition action plan, which would see developing countries see that as a talk shop with no financial commitments. And that's really critical. We need financial commitments in order to address this crisis. And then the only other issue I think it's critical for people to know about it is the growing conversation about sustainable fuels. President Lula has a real focus on sustainable fuels, or so they're called. And I think the interest in biofuels may come from some partly good intentions, but presenting sustainable fuels as an equal pillar to renewables is misguided. These fuels often exaggerate climate impacts, worsen food insecurity, drive biodiversity loss. In Canada, there's a new study from Stand.Earth, which just came out in The Guardian, which shows that the pellets, the biofuels that Drax is using in the UK and calling renewable energy are being made from cutting down 250-year-old trees. So be very wary of that term, sustainable fuels. On the good side, we had on Monday, Cambodia join the 17 participating nations designing a fossil fuel treaty. That means we have 18 countries now. Sri Lanka and Bangladesh ministers from the floor also expressed their support and interest in joining at least 10 other countries who are now participating as observers. So we have 18 countries now formally at the table developing and participating in the development of fossil fuel treaty. We have about another 10 countries who are now sitting as observers. I feel very confident that in 2026, many of those countries will join as the table is set for formal negotiations of a fossil fuel treaty. And again, if you look back through history, many treaties were founded by 20 to 30 countries at the table who had strong ambition, who were creating strong rules, and then more countries would join as that table was set. And I think that's the moment that we're in right now. And that is incredibly exciting. It's been 10 years since Paris, and while emissions growth has slowed, it's still going up. 10 years since Paris, and the rising heat is now killing on average one person a minute around the world, according to the new Lancet reports. 10 years since Paris, and my own country and the US, Australia, and Norway, in that 10 years, have all increased their oil and gas production by 40%. The task in front of us is significant, but we have shifted the conversation. We have opened a door. We have, in fact, kicked open a door as a result of all of your work and the work of Indigenous peoples and frontline communities standing in front of those projects, in front of those bulldozers, and in front of those oil rigs. And we can't forget that. 10 years since Paris, and 1 billion babies have been born in that time. And I think a lot about what world we're leaving them. And I'm really excited about this door that's now open, about the growing momentum towards a fossil fuel treaty. I'm excited because we don't know what the future holds, but we know who can hold it. And I think it's the mothers, the aunties, the sisters, the grandmothers, as we fiercely protect those 1 billion babies. So I'm deeply grateful to the WECAN network for bringing us all together. And together, we won't just walk through that door, we'll march through it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zipporah. We deeply appreciate your leadership and your work and your vision, because we're at the stage where we have to have global governance and multilateral agreements. And so giving the opportunity to create this mechanism outside of the COP space, I think is so valuable. Also because there's been such a co-option of the space by industry. And so I think the treaty comes and that conversation comes at such a critical time. And I couldn't agree more, because we don't have time. We don't have time. So thank you so much. And it was really great to see you here, and always appreciate you and your team doing such fabulous work. And just to say before we hand the floor to our next guest is that I was really moved actually being in the room when at the event here that you put on, and the minister from Cambodia stood up to make his announcement. I won't lie, I cried. It was like, so yes, we're going to do this, and the momentum, the inspiration, and the dedication when it's so hard to stand up to the fossil fuel industry, and seeing governments do that is really inspiring. So just wanted to say that was a highlight here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was really exciting. We didn't even know it was coming. That was really thank you
Even
all.
more exciting. Yeah. So now I'm going to hand the floor to a dear colleague, Natty Green. She's the Global Director of the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature. And WECAN is really honored to be on the Executive Committee of the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature. And it was amazing what happened with the work of Rights of Nature here, with 4 days of very powerful work. At the beginning of COP30, we had assemblies, we had a very big international tribunal. We had announcements and pledges, and it's very exciting because those of you who have been following us, we've done several press conferences on rights of nature. We can put out a report talking about how rights of nature is central to the just transition. And the whole idea that nature is a rights-bearing entity is missing from the formal negotiations. So we can put Mother Earth at the center of the conversation, which is shocking, but that's also what's missing from here, is remembering what it is we're really talking about, and the very sacredness of the web of life, and ensuring that we actually stay within planetary boundaries. And rights of nature is such an incredible framework to house social justice, environmental justice, racial justice, economic justice, and justice for the earth herself. So I'm really glad to have you here, Natty, with us. Please give us your takeaways from COP30. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Osprey and the WECAN Network, for having me here. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be sharing what we lived in Belém. Thank you also, Sephora, for all the work that you guys are doing. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have you, actually, both of you, to be also our tribunal judges. One of the things that we did during our pre-COP summit, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature pre-COP summit, was that we held as the 6th International Rights of Nature Tribunal, in which we were actually talking exactly what Sephora was mentioning right here, about the need for the end of the fossil fuel era, and that need for the transition does not mean the deepening of the mining model that is really affecting territories like mine in Ecuador. So what we were doing during those 4 days, that was like filled with excitement, with love, with energy, was really bringing the idea forward of the rights of nature. And I think it was an extremely powerful, not only for the event, but also what followed, because many people from the GAR network stayed in Belém. And we kept on talking throughout the negotiations, that I completely feel that the right of nature was completely embedded within what happened during COP during these last weeks. And why is that? That's because, as Sephora was saying, we are shifting the conversation. Governments are really trying to resist a change. They're really trying to hold on to fossil fuels, but civil society is bringing a really clear message that we need to change how we relate to nature. And to do that, we need to understand that we are nature protecting itself. And that's what we had been doing in that pre-COP summit, during the celebration of the 15-year anniversary of the rights of nature, of GARN, during the planning for the next years, doing an indigenous gathering that was able to bring together more than 100 leaders from all over the world that are really pushing and promoting the rights of nature, and doing a tribunal that gave a really strong message about a new pact with Mother Earth, a pact that needs to be taken into consideration by governments, but especially by civil society that is driving this change. A very important message that we were taking to COP this year was the idea of the rights of the Amazon. We have been promoting the Declaration for the Rights of the Amazon. That is something that came out of FOSPA in Bolivia. And this idea of giving biomes, big biomes like the Antarctica or the Amazon, its own rights, its own voice, is really essential, and especially important in spaces like COP30 that happen in the heart of the Amazon in Belém, because we need to understand that a new governance system is needed where we have and bring the voice of the Amazon. One day, hopefully, Sephora, we don't only talk about fossil fuels. We should be past that, because we know about its impact, but we can also have a pavilion of the Amazon, of the forest, for it speaking by itself. So I think it's really important. What happened even today at COP with the fire shows us in Belém a real small capsule of an ecological collapse. You know, all the heat that we lived in Belém, all the rain that we live, even the fires, is in a nutshell what the world is living with an ecological collapse. And if we don't see those signs that are coming up, that we need to change everything that we have been doing to really understand that we are nature, that nature has inherent rights, that those rights need to be respected, that the voice of nature needs to be heard, and that we need to follow the lead of civil society, but also of governments like the government of Panama, that during this COP gave a really important pledge for nature and is leading the way for the rights of nature movement. So I think it's really important that we take those into consideration, that we see in a nutshell what can happen with that ecological collapse, that we know that it's here, but that we still have a chance to change our relationship. And in doing that, we had a really important thing that was happening during those 2 weeks. That was that Ecuador was getting prepared for a really important voting. As you know, my country, Ecuador, was the first country in the world to recognize the rights of nature in its constitution, and it was threatened. These rights were threatened because last Sunday, that's the reason why I had to leave early of COP. We were voting in order to either change or maintain the constitution in Ecuador. And the reason why more than 65% of the population of Ecuador voted in favor of living and keeping this constitution alive is because of the rights of nature. It's because there's been an awakening of the world, with more than 40 countries recognizing the rights of nature, 22 with legislation, 18 with projects that are really advancing the rights of nature. Motions being passed at the IUCN Congress, with policies around them being awarded, with people like Marilu Ñaquiri and Maria Teresa Vicente being given the Goldman Prize. Everything really understanding that we are promoting a different change, and that is why majorly Ecuador voted in favor of the no, and the world was really supporting the rights of nature. So I just want to end by saying I'm putting here a link to the press release, because we were able to give this in COP, but I really want to take this opportunity to say that during COP, the rights of nature was really present, was there. We know that we need to change the way we relate to nature, and civil society is leading the way. So thank you, WECAN, for this opportunity and for really making the voice of nature be heard during these negotiations.
Thank you so much, Nadine. It was so great being here with you, and thank you for all your leadership. You put out a huge effort here for all of the activities that you just mentioned, and it is really important. And I actually have the reports here. We're going to put them in the link. Rights of nature as a central pillar of a just transition, which really shows that connection to the just transition work. And as Nadie was talking about, there's a pledge for Mother Earth that was brought forward in the assembly, and we'll put the link to that. And it was mentioned also at our tribunal, and all the judges signed a pledge for nature. And then also I wanted to mention that we are circulating an initiative for governments around the world to get involved in an initiative to have a universal declaration on the rights of Mother Earth, which only makes sense. Like, if we don't listen to Mother Earth, we're not going to survive. So it's very important that we have these different initiatives that are helping us to see another vision going forward, out of business as usual and out of these systems that are collapsing, while we're also here fighting within the halls of COP30 and making the best of what we have, because we need to do both. We refuse to not be here as civil society, Indigenous people, frontline communities, local communities. We're here because we're stopping a lot of harm, and we are intervening with different ideas. And we need to have this ecosystem of building the new, creating our own sites of work that we're doing, and imagination and forward motion on the world that we love and want, but also stopping harms and intervening with governments, because this is the actual decisions that are being made now. And with that, I would really love to have the word from Aishka Najib. She is Women and Gender Constituency Just Transition Working Group lead, and she's from Friday from Future, as well as UNICEF Youth Advocate from the Arab United Emirates. And she's a dear colleague and a fierce warrioress. And I'm going to hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Osprey. And it really is a pleasure to be here and share this space with incredible speakers that went before me. And honestly, all of my synapses just got fired up listening to you all. And I just wanted to also make sure that I'm sharing some updates about the just transition negotiations that is happening right now at COP30, and making it accessible to folks who could not be here on ground, but also really sharing some of the work and power that civil society has been showing this year that we really, really need to acknowledge and that we really need to celebrate in so many ways. So for a quick contextualization, the just transition negotiations under the UNFCCC mainly happens under what we call the Just Transition Work Program. This work program was adopted in UAE at COP28, and it is a 3-year work program, which means it comes to an end in 2026. This work program does have quite, an ambitious scope. Scope is basically like narrowing down the focus of what we want to achieve through that work program. And it talks about labor rights, decent and quality jobs, social dialogue, social protection, having national just transition plans, international cooperation, also seeing just transition from the lens of adaptation, and so on. It's a lot of important work to be done. However, what this work program compromised on is that the modality of this work program is to have dialogues twice a year. So modality is basically how do you get to the goals that you have outlined, right? And this modality that has been confined to just dialogues twice a year. And we all know that we cannot talk our way out of the climate crisis. We do not need another book club, right? We need action, we need implementation on the ground. And that is what communities around the world is asking for. And so I believe that it was us observer constituencies, basically the rights holders, so from the feminists, the youth, indigenous peoples, trade unions, and environmental NGOs, we were like, we're not going to give up on the work that has to be done under the UNFCCC. Rather, we're going to be the ones who's going to go back home, do the homework, do the thinking, and come back with a concrete proposal and solution to put on the table, because we felt like the parties were not doing their responsibility. They were coming time and time again into these conferences and talking about how we have to move from talks and dialogues to implementation, but not offering a proposal on the table. And so this is how the Belém action mechanism came to be, or a just transition mechanism, right, for global just transition around the world. And this mechanism really initiated from young feminist leadership, and now it has been shaped and strengthened, and it is such a big campaign that everybody is talking about. It is all over COP. It is the hot topic. It is all over media. And we really need to recognize the work that went behind this mechanism, so that we're not extractive of the work that's been done, especially by young feminists along the way. To quickly kind of give a summary of what this mechanism is and why it's important is that to make sure that we are really moving from dialogues to action, we need a mechanism that can coordinate, that can generate knowledge, and that can act as an implementation and support arm. So these are the 3 functions of the mechanism, and I can share a lot of the links with more resources around the mechanism. And I always use this analogy to kind of help people understand what this mechanism is about. If you really think about it, a mechanism is like the Google Maps. It's like a tool. It's basically the direction that we need to get to just transition, and the goals that we have outlined on just transition. So just think about it as a tool, like a Google map, that is giving you the way forward and setting the path forward. So right now in the current negotiation text, we can see that there is a paragraph around mechanism. We're waiting for the new text to drop, but we have been receiving intel from the parties that there is quite a strong paragraph on the mechanism outlining these 3 functions, and also a paragraph before this stating the importance of stakeholder engagement, which is a core element of the mechanism through the coordination entity. And last but not the least, I'm sure that there's been conversation happening around, how there's been a counter proposal from the EU on the Just Transition Action Plan or a toolbox, and as Sephora mentioned, but all of these are not enough. A action plan is not enough. A toolbox is not enough. We need a mechanism. We need an institutional arrangement put in place. In the documents that I'll share later, there's also a brief that kind of writes down the difference between a mechanism and an action plan, and how a mechanism is much more important than an action plan. I can share all these resources with you guys. And coming from a feminist perspective, another key issue for us is the care economy, because oftentimes when we talk about just transition, we talk about labor rights, but we forget whose labor are we talking about. And most of the time it is women and gender diverse people's labor that is ignored, that is underrepresented, that is underpaid and unrecognized in so many ways. And so we've been fighting since the onset to have care work recognized. And we're really happy to see that in the paragraph 12, in the list of the outcomes that has come from the dialogue, one of the paragraph explicitly mentions care economy. And this is a priority for the Women and Gender constituency. And this is something that we are fighting to make sure it crosses the finish line. And of course, there is language around phasing out of fossil fuels, and it has been disheartening and really breaking the trust in the system to see parties sit there and renegotiate the language on fossil fuels, because we worked so hard to establish it at COP28 text, and it is agreed language. And I feel like we should hold all of the parties accountable, because they have agreed to it and they cannot roll back on their promises. Fighting for fossil fuel language is not ambitious. It's basically just a survival strategy. We should stop the narrative that having fossil fuel language is an ambitious outcome. It is not. It is a survival strategy that the world really needs. And I will stop there because I'm also conscious of time, and I will share all of the resources that I mentioned. And if there's any questions, and if you want to continue this conversation, I'm always open and I'm always there. And I'm sure Osprey can share my contact, and happy to have that conversations with anybody here. Thank you so much for giving me the space.
Thank you so much, Aishka. I really appreciate your detailed response on what's happening in the Just Transition Work Program and your leadership. Aishka is a policy wonk, I think we could use that term, deep into the negotiations for many years, and is a terrific leader in this space. And yes, I think a very important point around the fact of renegotiating the fossil fuel language is really unacceptable at this stage. We need to be moving on to implementation and mechanisms and not discussing it again. And this is also true of the Gender Action Plan, where we're back at defining gender and non-binary concepts of gender when that language was already passed, and now we're going backwards. And I think this is one of the most frustrating things about the negotiations, is things that we've earned and gained and finished, then countries go back on it and spend time doing that instead of the actual implementation going forward. So it takes a lot of determination, struggle, and fight to really push these things to the finish line. So thank you very much for all of your work and dedication. And now I'm very honored to bring into the conversation Maria Reyes. She is climate and human rights activist and fundraising coordinator of the Alliance of Non-Governmental Radical Youth. And I love to say this, their acronym is ANGRY, and she is from Mexico. Please, you have the floor, Maria.
Thank you, Osprey. I am part of the Alliance of Non-Governmental Radical Youth, and I'm co-coordinating our work on the intersection of climate and demilitarization. And so I want to speak from that intersection right now, and I'm gonna be very real with you, because things that happened today at the venue feel like very fresh in terms of how we can see, as one of the previous speakers were sharing before, how we can see COP30 being a microcosm of what's happening around the world. And one of the ways in we can see that, it's around the heavy deployment of militarization in the space. And one of the ways we can also see how the military, it's a false climate solution, and it's a false way to keep people safe, because around the world, governments are using the narrative of climate security in order to militarize their responses to the climate crisis, and in order to use climate finance and climate budgets to make sure that military is included into this mega projects, such as some ways of renewable energy, some ways of geoengineering, and carbon markets that are used as false climate solutions. And the reason why I was referencing what happened today at the venue with the incident of the fire was because, at least from my personal experience and like my personal testimony, you could see how, and I will honestly remember this COP as the most militarized COP ever. This is my 5th COP, and I have never seen this level of military presence, even in countries that were so-called authoritarian. And it really leads you to think that at this point in global politics, there's no authoritarian countries, only officially authoritarian countries and non-officially authoritarian countries. But any country can become authoritarian under the pressure of international mechanisms to protect what they make us believe is people's lives, but it's actually just corporate greed. And so what we saw today was that like the military presence in the space was so intense, but they were not helping people evacuate the venue. Like people were literally jumping the fences because some of the emergency exits were locked, and people were trapped inside to go inside the venue. That's only my personal testimony of things I could see with my own eyes, and like the military on the other side of the fence literally not being useful at all. And it's such a harsh reminder of how this happens in the real world and how this happens for communities all over the world. Because for those that live in heavily militarized parts of the world, coming to COP and seeing this space being so heavily militarized has been very triggering. But it's also a way for us to open the conversation about this big elephant in the room, which is also the military emissions that are unaccounted for under the UNFCCC mechanism. Like under the Paris Agreement, military emissions continue to be not reported in like a mandatory way. There are ways in which countries can do it if they want to, but most, of course, do not. And this does not only include the military emissions that are produced in each of the countries, but also the military bases that they have abroad, such as the US, for example, and the military bases that not only they have, but that they create the capacity for. So I think it's very, very important that we use this fresh memories in people's minds about the militarization in this space to talk about the militarization and climate, and talk about how militarization is not accounted for in the official ways of measuring emissions. According to civil society, in the last few years, it has been estimated that military emissions globally make up around 4.5% of global emissions, which makes the military industrial complex worldwide the 5th emitter of polluting emissions in the world, even ahead of Russia. So this really paints a picture of how much of a blind spot continuing to not measure the military emissions is bringing to the conversations. And during COP30, there were demands from different civil society constituencies and civil society organizations. Even there were petitions for this military emissions to be like formally accounted for, and we really didn't get anywhere with that. So I wanted to strongly emphasize that. And I also wanted to emphasize how when you talk about the climate crisis with local and frontline communities that are experiencing this every day, most people will not know what a just transition is. Most people will not know what COP is and what climate negotiations are, but they will know what militarization and false solutions are because they have to face the impacts of them every single day. And so it is very important to also highlight how the actual issues that affect communities on the ground are hidden within the texts, are hidden within the negotiations. There is no official negotiation track to be following like fall solutions. Of course, there's something about Article 6 where carbon markets are mentioned, but like carbon markets are not the only fall solutions that is advanced in the space. So it's super important that as we continue to advocate for a fossil fuel phase out, that we also do it critically and continue to put at the center the values of decolonization and against extractivism, so that the solutions that we are advocating for do not continue to replicate the same system of extractivism that got us into this place. So I wanted to share some of those reflections. And lastly, I also wanted to share that the militarization of COP30 had a huge impact on shrinking and restricting the civic space at COP30. At the beginning of the conference, during the first week, we were allowed to protest outside, and there were several peaceful protests that happened, and that I myself was part of coordinating. But after the October 11th protests led by local and indigenous peoples from Brazil, the military crackdown was very, very evident, to the point that international civil society was very much restricted from continuing to organize protests outside, but it also had a big impact of the civic space inside, where every single year the UNFCCC Secretariat continues to add regulations and rules to organizing protests. And it's very important to remember that the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties is the only UN conference where protests are allowed. And so it is very important for us to continue to defend this civic space inside the UN, because it is one of the only ways in which we have some sort of a mechanism to express things that go beyond the official negotiation tracks. So thank you very much for the space.
Thank you so much. It's really great to hear from you, Maria, and thank you for all of your hard work. And I also, want to extend love and care for a lot of the Indigenous people, frontline communities, and frontline activists who have been intimidated the last few weeks because of the militarization. And it's not okay. And just to say it's not okay, and that we need to all stand really in solidarity. There was a letter that went out. I know that WECAN signed it. I think others probably on this call have as well, speaking to the COP presidency and speaking out against this buildup of the militarization of the COP space. And I think we have to speak out and make it clear that we don't agree with it. So thank you for mentioning that and for all of your good work. And also to say, since we've been talking about this roadmap that we're waiting to hear more text on, this roadmap on fossil fuel phase out, let's be really clear. Even if something like that does surface here at this COP, it doesn't mean it will have a climate justice lens. It doesn't mean that people are going to understand that we don't want to substitute a fossil fuel economy with an economy based on mining for transition minerals. So it is a really progressive forward move. We've got, we're excited about it. There's some potentiality here, but there'll be lots to fight over to ensure that it is based on justice and rights. And with that, I'm really honored to have here with us a dear colleague, Ariel Deringer. She is Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. She's president of Indigenous Climate Action. She is a 2024 Climate Breakthrough Award winner from Turtle Island, Canada. And it's just been so great to be here with you, Ariel, and be on some panels and to see the terrific work you're doing and the announcements you've made. And thank you for taking time with us.
Thank you, Messi Cho. So iklanete dene sotlene ta eril tse ekwehushe duranje bitsi ni hasli. So I just introduced myself in my traditional Indigenous language, which is Dene or Dene Sotlene. And I just want to say thank you for inviting me into this speaker series and for all the other speakers who came before me. I think that today was such a strange and jarring day, COP really went up in flames. and not to be like crass about it, but it is really a symbol of just how things continue to go within these spaces. And, you know, some of the comments that Sephora made and others have made is that having spaces outside of COP has become intrinsically important to actually moving the agenda forward on real climate action. And as an Indigenous person who's been involved in these spaces since 2009 and has been involved in the advocacy for Indigenous rights at the UN level for over 2 decades at this point, 2.5 decades, this work is deeply important to me. And this COP was branded as the Indigenous Peoples COP, and we saw an incredible mobilization of Indigenous peoples attendance this year, with I think of over 3,000 Indigenous representatives within the halls of the Blue Zone and at COP this year, and that's an incredible feat. But again, as some of the stats already shared, over 16,000 oil and gas lobbyists. So 1 in 25 participants at COP were oil and gas lobbyists. And what is going on is that Indigenous peoples continue to be at the forefront of the interests, like have external interests that are interested in our lands and our territory, either for exploitation, for continuing oil and gas and other extractive industries, or for false solutions like carbon offsets and mechanisms that don't actually reduce emissions and are just systems that are created to green light and greenwash, and in some cases red wash, put the stamp in the face of Indigenous peoples on the front of their solutions. And this Indigenous COP has been really beautiful and really tragic at the same time. We heard about the murder of an Indigenous land defender just earlier this week. In the wake of all of this, here in Brazil, we have continued to see the protests and the demonstrations led by Indigenous land defenders here in Brazil, who were very, very frustrated with the fact that they are excluded from these spaces. And even those Indigenous peoples that enter into these spaces, we are still simply observers. We don't have a full seat at the table. And, you know, a really wonderful chief from Turtle Island once said that if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. And this is where we're at right now. And so a lot of the negotiations that have been moving forward for the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Movement, led by the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, are really about ensuring that there is full recognition of the rights and the specific protection measures for Indigenous peoples, and particularly Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact, and in line with international instruments and principles. And this is really important when we start to talk about things like climate finance. Right now, there aren't enough direct references to equitable engagement and ethical utilization of the knowledge of Indigenous peoples as distinct from and equal to the best available science. I need you to hear this again. We talk about Indigenous knowledge being critical, but it is not being held as a form of science that is equal to the best available science. It is instead often co-opted by colonial governments and corporations and repackaged in a perverted form that does not embody Indigenous cosmology and relationships to the natural world. We heard that nature is the key to our survival, and yet we're still trying to find ways to contort it and twist it to the powers of colonial capitalism. And we also the Indigenous peoples have been really trying to mobilize and push parties to respect, promote, protect, and implement the distinct and internationally recognized rights of Indigenous peoples, including our right to free, prior, and informed consent and self-determination in all areas of climate action. And those match the demands of the Indigenous peoples that held demonstrations throughout the COP30 this year. And then, of course, when it comes to just transition, we've heard a lot about just transition this year. And I think that one thing that needs to be really recognized with this is just transition is deeply attached to the phase out of fossil fuels. It's deeply attached to the challenges that we see with false solutions and carbon markets. And it's also deeply attached to the dangers that are currently being put out there that state that we should be doing more extraction in order to usher in the renewable energy transition and just transition strategies. We cannot afford to replicate the same colonial practices of extractivism to create a so-called just transition. And so we need to strengthen the consideration of Indigenous peoples by explicitly referencing them as distinct right holders with individual and collective rights affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the consideration of their contributions to climate change. And what are those contributions? Those contributions are Indigenous peoples are not just the ones connected to nature and having those relationships. We're at the forefront of defending our lands and territories, like our brother who was murdered earlier this week. And that has actual tangible impacts in mitigating and avoiding emissions that are not being honored and recognized. Instead, Indigenous peoples are criminalized, and we are viewed as obstructions to development and advancement for either the continuation of oil and gas or the movement towards false solutions. And this also ends up with being over militarization. And I thank my sister who brought that up, because we saw the overt and absolutely outrageous response of the militarization of these spaces. And this is what happens to Indigenous peoples all the time when we try to protect our lands and territories. And of course, last, we have to talk about Indigenous peoples need to have those distinct rights within a just transition program and strategy, because if those get left behind, we are going to see the replication of those same practices over and over again. And we need real resources to advance Indigenous solutions. And that means direct and equitable access to climate financing for all 7 sociocultural regions. So it should not matter where we exist in the world. It should not be a bifurcation of the North and the South, but we need to have equitable access. And we need to encourage relevant funding entities to develop specific funding arrangements to ensure that that happens. And this means no loans, direct financing. And so I just want to wrap things up that at this COP, I launched a brand new project called the Woven Project that is really looking at how we weave Indigenous knowledges together. Because we have a tendency to flatten and create a pan-indigeneity or a homogenous Indigenous understanding, when the reality is Indigenous peoples are as diverse as the ecosystems that we come from. And that we have incredible knowledge and sciences that have been built upon a millennia, and we have solutions that are not being recognized, and we need spaces to weave those knowledges together to strengthen our strategies and advance real climate solutions that are not limited by colonial capitalism and systems of empirical science and data that really drive Indigenous knowledge forward, and that are rooted in our cultures, our identity, free, prior, and informed consent, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We will be advocating for land back, and we will be doing this outside of the UN systems, but hoping to support those that continue to enter into these spaces to come together with more cohesive and collective strategies that advance Indigenous movements beyond observer status and having that seat at the table. Because again, without a seat at the table, we just continue to be on the menu. So we must uphold Indigenous rights now, movement towards land back, and it doesn't stop when these negotiation ends. The real work happens in community, where we're already seeing land defenders saving and safeguarding the critical biodiversity that's necessary for global planetary health and climate stabilization. Without Indigenous peoples, there is no justice for the planet. Thank you, Masicho.
Thank you so much, Ariel, for your powerful words. And it's been so great to have you here. And I'm really excited about the launch of your project Woven, and how that is going to really provide a resource. I mean, there'll be much more than resource, but a way for people to really visualize and see what you're talking about. And as you say, create independent sovereign spaces for Indigenous people to be able to claim all those solutions that have been going on for thousands of years, and that demonstration to the world at every level. So I'm really excited about your project and your leadership, and the role of how important Indigenous peoples are to this space, but also how it has been so incredibly difficult. We were one of the things that people might not know is that in addition to all the amazing delegates from Indigenous nations that have been at the COP, that there has also been other spaces here where Indigenous peoples have been meeting. There's been an Indigenous village that has, as I understand it, 3,500 people who've come from all over Brazil and other territories to come and be here. And they are doing their own work, and they're doing their own meetings, and they're exchanging. I know our team went over there to meet some of our Indigenous partners to do reforestation work. And so I also think it's good that we paint this picture that there's all this work that we're here for the COP, but also it's been an opportunity for Indigenous people from all over the world to meet and build strategy and build power. And it's been extraordinary. And it's also very inspiring to know this, because we can't just depend, obviously, on this COP space at all. And I wanted to share two quick reports that WECAN has put out this week. Indigenous rights are vital to a healthy and just world. Guidance and recommendations for the UNFCCC and governments, which talks a lot about, as Ariel had described so perfectly, the need for Indigenous rights, because there really isn't a climate solution without Indigenous rights. It's just not possible. So this is why we're uplifting their rights. And you would be surprised how many negotiators are unaware of Indigenous rights, don't know what FPIC is, or if they do know about it, are very fine with violating those rights. And so all of that has to change. And then lastly, because of this very tragic incident, I'm sure there's more we don't even know about, of this land defender being murdered while we were here, while we're talking about Indigenous peoples being a solution, we also put out these reports called Escalating Agreement Toolkit for Women Land Defenders and Frontline Communities. And the Escalating Agreement is very specific to the LAC region, the Latin American Caribbean region. It's a multilateral agreement here that is very important to granting access to grassroots leaders, civil society, about access to environmental information, but it also is about protecting land defenders. And so this toolkit is in Portuguese and Spanish and English from different countries, really breaking down, if you are a land defender, this is specifically for women land defenders who are being threatened, what do you do? So we've created these toolkits so that if you're being threatened, you can learn about what your country-specific laws are and how the Escalating Agreement specifically relates to Peru or Ecuador, Brazil, and also how you can reach pro bono attorneys. So when you're threatened, you have a way to access this agreement. So I wanted to share those resources. And then with that, I'm really honored to bring on our next guest, Sheila Barefoot, who is Apache, and she is Environmental Health and Justice Program Manager from Poetry for Planet from Turtle Island, USA. Sheila, you have the floor. I think she's here. Yes, there you are. Thank you. And thanks again, Ariel.
Okay, thanks, Osprey. Apologies. The COP has taken a toll on my voice, so it's a bit squeaky today. And while I was indeed a environmental health and justice manager at Poetry for Planet, I actually quite recently have been hired as an environmental health advocate at Indigenous peoples of the Coastal Bend. So yes, continuing to just do more and more things and try and expand my knowledge and continue to work with various other Indigenous peoples who are fighting the fight like the rest of us are. I am definitely a little bit more frazzled than I normally would be. Given the circumstances from yesterday, I was pretty close to the part of the section of the pavilions that caught on fire. So just had a little bit of stuff to deal with there. But the main theme that I really wanted to bring forward from some of the negotiations is, well, twofold. One, I want to talk a little bit about youth and Indigenous youth in particular. And then the other thing that I really want to emphasize is the human rights language and Indigenous rights language and the times in which people are okay using human rights, but not Indigenous rights. So as far as some of the work that the International Indigenous Youth Forum on Climate Change has been doing, we're releasing our first position paper. That's something that was decided upon collectively about about a month before COP began. So it was something that it's something that we've been working on for a while, and we're really looking forward to build off of it. So that way there is direct representation and articulation of issues that are facing Indigenous youth in particular, because we occupy a very interesting space, especially considering indigeneity is so frequently historicized by settlers and romanticized, and in general it's treated as though you need to be in kind of a static state, and in general that static state for delivering the types of nativeness that settlers, and in particular settlers in negotiation spaces, find acceptable tends to come with being older, and a lot of youth who might have both might be a bit more vocal about being radical. I'm not saying that the elders aren't radical, because a lot of them are, but sometimes we haven't. I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I haven't learned to keep my mouth shut when I probably should, and I'm assuming I'll grow into that. I just haven't grown into it yet. But so there's that, and it's almost interesting in the sense that it's sort of like being an Indigenous youth and being a young person makes you susceptible for a double type of tokenization, because they just want youth representation, but they don't want youth voices. And on top of that, you're not even meeting their warped settler expectations for what being a acceptable Indigenous person is. So yeah, that's a interesting issue as we're trying to navigate some of these negotiation spaces. And then, of course, because we're going to be the ones who have to handle the rest of the climate collapsing. This is the future that we're walking into, and so many people and so many youth in particular have had experiences with being separated from land, disconnected from land, and we've basically had a shortened time frame to be able to connect with cultural sites and sacred sites. And that's something that causes a kind of unique form of trauma, I would say. And I don't think it's something that is discussed as much, but it is something that, while not exclusive to youth, impacts a lot of youth. And because it feels like our time is completely running out, that just adds an additional layer of pressure onto it. Getting into the second thing I wanted to touch on, I've been doing a little bit of work in the Just Transition Working Group for the Indigenous Peoples constituency, and I'm not gonna call out countries by name because I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to, but there have been multiple instances where I've been watching these negotiations, and certain countries will argue against very specific language in the text. There's arguments against gender equity. There's arguments against distinct rights. There's arguments against, again, Indigenous rights, like the rights of Indigenous peoples, rather. And however, they are comfortable substituting in human rights language. And as I was preparing for another panel that ended up not happening because of the fire, it just kind of struck me, or rather, this is something that's struck me for a while, and I kind of just had a little light bulb on it, that it is profoundly messed up that a preference for human rights language, because it includes all humans, and not willing to make a distinct rights of Indigenous peoples and not even being willing to include that into the text, pretty much just means you don't think we're human if we are being unapologetically and authentically Indigenous. And I feel like that is a colonial attitude that seeps into a lot of negotiations, a lot of policies. And unless that's addressed, unless we're actually able to be treated like human beings in all of our indigeneity, in wanting to connect with our cultures in ways that might not be palatable for the settler gaze or might not be palatable for settler ears, we're not going to get anywhere until we shift this mindset. So pretty sure that was about 6 minutes. I know that things have probably moved just a tiny bit, but yeah, that's pretty much what I've got for 6 minutes and doing kind of a report back from some of the things that I've been working on with the International Indigenous Youth Forum on Climate Change and then the Just Transition Working Group within the Indigenous Peoples constituency. And we're all pretty sure that negotiations are going to continue dragging on since there was kind of a big interruption today.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And it's really an honor to have you here taking some time with us. And I know it has really been a really big day. And it let's not kid ourselves. It's really stressful with the fire. And I appreciate you taking time. And I hope you and your team are okay. There's a lot going on. And I really appreciate you bringing forward this very refined point about human rights and Indigenous rights and that distinct language that's so important. And as I've learned, and other Indigenous leaders are welcome to jump in, but I wanted to just share for our audience who might not be so familiar with this, but the offense, as Sheila stated, of not being respected as an Indigenous person when we X out human rights, really taking that to heart, Sheila, but also, as I have learned from Indigenous peoples, and I'm sure they can state this better than me, but I think it's important to state like how hard Indigenous peoples fought for there to be the Universal Declaration on Indigenous Rights, distinct from human rights. And some of that has to do with the fact that these are collective rights. It's like when we talk about human rights, it's like my human right to my own well-being, which is very important. We all should have human rights to water and to food and to shelter, these things that are human rights. But Indigenous peoples have collective rights, and that was hard fought for. And part of that also has to do with something Ariel brought up around free, prior, and informed consent. This consent to territories and the rights that go along with being on their own territories and land. And that is something unique to Indigenous peoples that we must respect, just because we should, period, but also because of the points that Indigenous speakers on this call have already made about the biodiversity and the care for the land and the tending for the land that has gone on in their traditional territories since time immemorial, and the fact that we all need Indigenous peoples to be on their own land, rematriate land that has been stolen, and it will be better for everyone, for Indigenous peoples, for the rest of the world, to have Indigenous lands be returned to them for the proper tending and care that has gone on for generation after generation, and that we should be sitting at the feet of Indigenous people, learning how to live on these territories. So I really appreciate you really bringing a fine point to this, that we cannot be lumping everything together. I think it's very important that Indigenous rights have its own distinction and should be maintained in all negotiations. So thank you for that really important point. And I also wanted to give just a little update, because I know there's people here listening who are actually still here in Brazil with us. I'm just going to read what came out about the fire so that we're updated. Earlier today, a fire broke out in the blue zone of the COP30 venue in Belém. The fire department and UN security officers responded swiftly, and the fire was controlled in approximately 6 minutes. People were evacuated safely. 13 individuals were treated on site for smoke inhalation. Their condition is being monitored, and appropriate medical support has been provided. As a precaution, the Brazilian government and the UNFCCC have jointly decided to temporarily close the blue zone while the fire department carries out a comprehensive state safety assessment. Delegates are requested to await further official communication, which will be issued at 8:00 p.m. Brazil time this evening, once the venue has been thoroughly evaluated and deemed fully safe. We appreciate the cooperation and understanding of all participants as we provide the safety of everyone involved. And please note that the green zone is open. All right, so it is, around 6 o'clock here. So in a couple of hours, we'll hear what's going to happen with the negotiations and if they're going to open up the venue again and how that's going to actually impact, this really critical time that we're in at the turning point of the negotiations here. And I'm looking to my team if there's another speaker on the call I can hand the floor to, or we also have a video we wanted to share with you. Maybe I could get some guidance from my team because I haven't been able to look at the recent chat.
Yeah, Osprey, we do have Zukiswa on the line.
Ah, awesome. Okay, thank you. Let me do a proper introduction. We have Zukiswa White. She is the gender advisor for the African Women's Development and Communications Network, FEMNET, from South Africa. And it's so great to have you here, Zukiswa. We've been on some press conferences and at different events, and you carry a wonderful torch for our movement, and you have the floor. Thank you for being with us. Are you there, Zukiswa?
Yes, apologies. I was moving somewhere where I hope you can hear me.
You're all good. We see you, we
Fantastic.
hear you. You're great, and you have beautiful green light around you.
Thank you so much, Osprey and the WECAN team. I will get right into it. Also feeling very grateful for safety, that all, no comrades are relatively okay. It was a scary experience. However, let's get right into it. Shall I go on, Osprey?
Yes.
Awesome.
Your girl
I'll try
just
to-
jumping in and giving our feedback on COP30 and at the stage, and just fire away.
Fantastic. All right. Once again, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're calling from in the world. Of course, reporting from here in Belém, I do want to begin by naming what for me this COP has already shown us, that indigenous and local protectors of the Amazon were forced out of these spaces, kicked out by security for the crime of defending their lands, while fossil fuel lobbyists in this space roam freely. For me, as an African feminist, I also know that they outnumber delegations of our countries on the continent, right? Even as indigenous people of the Amazon are kicked out of this space. And so we as African feminists stand in absolute solidarity with those who were silenced and removed. I also wanted to begin by acknowledging that today is Black Consciousness Day here in Brazil. And of course, we affirm what Dandara Das Palmares, what Leila Gonzalez and our own Pan-African feminist movements have always known, that the struggles against racism, colonialism, and climate injustice are inseparable. There can be no climate justice on colonized lands, no liberation without decolonization, and of course there can't be freedom while Black and Indigenous peoples around the world remain under siege, whether by military occupation, extractivist violence, or so-called climate solutions built on dispossession. What are we actually seeing in these negotiation rooms? This COP is negotiating terms of a new extractivism that, if we do not hold the line against, will simply be colonization in another name. Green energy, green extractivism marked as clean, but built on the same colonial violence as fossil fuel extractivism. On gender, we are seeing systematic erasure right now. Developed countries and other reactionary states are systematically wanting to erase gender from negotiation texts. The Gender Action Plan draft is so heavily bracketed that it is barely recognizable. In the mitigation work program, they have completely removed all gender references, erasing even the modest language that was fought for at COP29. States like Argentina, Paraguay, the Vatican are pushing to narrow gender definitions, equating gender solely with biological sex, a deliberate tactic to stall negotiations and, of course, exclude queer and gender diverse community. Most critically as well, there are zero explicit climate finance commitments for gender. Now, the WGC has released a statement expressing this dismay, and we need to call this what it is. We're not disappointed. This is a systemic attempt to remove our rights and erase our experiences from climate policy, and we simply cannot and will not allow it. On climate finance, structural violence once again by design. Currently, climate finance flows 190 billion per year with a target of 1.3 trillion. But what they're not telling you is that of the minimal climate finance that actually reaches Africa, for example, and other global South countries, 80% of this arrives in loan, which is entrenching the global South into debt traps. And so unless there's a radical transformation of the finance architecture, it is not just simply failing to deliver justice, it is in fact designed to prevent it. Osby, you can tell me how much time I have with the microphone because I'm reading notes. I wanted to squeeze things together and provide an update. Finally, on the just transition, we're watching contradiction and obstruction collide. What does this mean? The G77 and China have proposed the Belém action mechanism, which of course as feminists, we stand firmly behind, which would be a coordinating structure that would provide technical assistance, match countries with finance, address debt burdens, and ensure meaningful participation of women, of workers, and indigenous people. The obstruction, developed countries, as usual, led this time by the UK and the EU, are questioning whether we need another mechanism, which just is translation for they don't actually want to move the Just Transition Work Program to the place of accountability or coordination that centers Global South priorities, which are so urgent. I'm worried about Osprey, but I am getting towards the end. Apologies.
Yes, why don't you go, you can go ahead and close up. That would be great. Thank you.
All right, cool. And so if we do not keep holding the line, the energy transition will potentially repeat extractive injustices under a green banner. And if we don't hold the line, we're going to be seeing gender being systematically erased, and they're not just going to stop at gender, right? They are going to remove indigenous next, Black race next, global South, global North next. So a lot is at stake with the backtracking and the ways in which, you know, indigenous peoples, women, youth continue to be used as political bargaining chips. In a nutshell, in these last few hours of COP30, we are pushing for the Belém action mechanism to be established with binding commitments. We are pushing for critical mineral governance to be respectful of free, prior, informed consent. We are pushing for climate finance that is accessible, ambitious, and rooted in reparative justice. We are pushing for women, indigenous people, youth, defenders and protectors of the land, rights holders to be elevated and given their rightful space and stake in this conversation, a transition that moves from extraction to regeneration, from debt and austerity to redistribution and care, and from colonial hierarchies to feminist, democratic, and decolonial governance. As I close, Osprey, it has not been an easy time at COP30, but indigenous movements, feminist movements around the world are holding the line quite strongly, particularly on issues of finance, the just transition, and of course, as feminists, the gender action plan. And I hope I've given a snapshot of what is at stake. We will keep holding the line, we will keep pushing, and perhaps even the fire that happened today is a reminder that even with a space like COP, where so much is put to protect us and push against disasters, something like that has happened. What more about communities on the front lines without the kind of social protection and backup plans, etc., that COP was able to institute timelessly so that lives can be saved? And so maybe this COP will be remembered not for the disaster, but hopefully this is a wake-up call to parties that what happened today is happening every day around the world because of climate impacts and disasters. But the difference is that there's no emergency systems to activate, no national budgets in place to push back against destruction. And so I hope that parties will sleep tonight, come back with a renewed vigor and commitment to get us to the finish line of COP30 with ambitious outcomes. Thank you so much, Osprey and team.
Thank you so much, Jakiswa. It's so great to hear from you and thank you for your analysis of the stage of the negotiations we're in right now. And I couldn't agree more. This fire has been I feel very, it's very tragic for the people who actually got sick and are inhaling fumes and have been hurt by this fire. So our thoughts are with them most specifically. But at a symbolic level, I think it hit everyone really hard today that this fire started and then the whole building was evacuated. And like to be all collectively put into a real live emergency situation really puts a punctuation point on the climate crisis, on the moment that we're in, and the fact that everything is so unpredictable, and the fact that we need to get on with caring for people, setting up systems of care, because here we are in this critical emergency and we were able to collectively respond, but that's not true for everyone. There is inequity, as you pointed out, and that's very critical. And I do hope this will add some reality to the negotiations and bring ambition and fire, the spirit of fire, to the negotiations. And we're going to bring on our next speaker in 1 second. I just wanted, because you're talking about climate finance, I did want to mention 2 reports that WECAN put out this week. One is called Justice-Based Climate Finance for COP30 and Beyond. It's absolutely critical that we understand a rights-based approach to climate finance. Where is the money coming from? Who is it going towards? And how do we ensure that money from the fossil fuel subsidies, as an example, are actually being used for a just transition? There's all this money available in fossil fuel subsidies being given to the military, militarization of the world. So much money is out there going to war and death and destruction. Where is the money for our communities? And this transition, we know, is critical. The money is there, and this report talks about how we can move the money from destruction towards people, towards community, towards well-being. That's what we need to be doing at this COP. And then the other report is the need for real zero, not net zero, shifting from false solutions to real solutions and a just transition, which breaks down false solutions. So many people are always asking us, what do you mean about a false solution? And what do you mean about the difference between net zero, which is often empty promises and empty pledges by governments, to what are real zero, meaning moving finance and moving decisions off of carbon offsets, fake markets that don't work, into real solutions that really serve people and planet. So I wanted to make those resources available to people. And with that, I'm very, very thankful that we could have with us Cheryl Capong. She's from the Chisholm Legacy Project and is the Global Afro-Descendants Climate Justice, and is also part of the Global Afro-Descendants Climate Justice Collaborative. She's from Turtle Island, USA, and we're really thankful to have you here with us, Cheryl. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Osprey. Apologies for the low quality of everything and also how tired and whatever I look. I'm also on my way out. So if I talk too fast at any point, let me know. I'm just trying to get a lot of information. So yeah, as we know, this was an Indigenous Peoples COP. This was a COP also of Afro-descendant. Brazil has the largest number of Afro-descendants outside of the continent of Africa. We've been fighting to get our recognition at the UNFCCC level, not only having Afro-descendant appear in official text, but also to be recognized as an official constituency, like women, like Indigenous, like youth. We want to be a recognized constituency at the UNFCCC level. We've had a lot of wins, I think, in terms of solidarity and I would say like shows of optics, as in I feel like the Afro-descendant community, specifically the ones who have been on the ground here at COP, the Brazilian women, have really been leading the way in terms of what their communities are asking for, fighting for, marching for in the streets. In Colombia, the vice president of Colombia, who is a powerhouse Afro-Colombian, has been one of our leaders from the governmental end in being able to get Afro-descendant included in the CBD COP, and had really been leading on some declarations here within Brazil and within this COP. There have been like a couple of negotiations going back and forth to see where things were like amongst our own community as Afro descendants, which is something that we have talked about pretty deeply, and making sure that we are having like shared messaging so that we can be on the same page, because it's really easy for these other entities to poke holes in what it is that we are wanting to add if we don't have one general consensus. So, I guess just giving kind of updates, the CBD COP was yeah, successful in including Afro descent, people of Afro descent into official language in the implementation, and also recognize like Afro descendants' long history with like cultivating and keeping up with the lands. And so there was like an attempt to at least make a political show of solidarity between Colombia, Brazil, and the other GULAC nations, which was finally successful as of yesterday, I believe. So that was definitely a win. We're following Afro descendants for 4 specific tracks: just transition, women and gender, adaptation, and climate finance. Now, within this COP context, is Afro descendant, is Afro descendant anywhere explicitly in the text, not bracketed, not on a list, like in there? No, it's not. And we understand that. And as much as the COP presidency, who has actually been in support of the inclusion of Afro descendant in text, it doesn't necessarily look like it is. I don't want to say it doesn't look like it's a possibility, because, anything can happen, right? But just thinking about what, you know, um, hoping for the best and preparing for the worst, it might not be the case. So we've been thinking about how we can move this a little bit down the line to get something in towards Bonn. We also had the opportunity to be in consultations on engagement of local communities and indigenous communities, because that is one of the only places that we can actually like advocate on behalf of Afro descendants being put into the text. So we were able to give our suggestion for those, because some of the Brazilian leaders were lending support for Afro descendants, and we gave our recommendations. Nothing was put in again. So it was definitely, like I said, I feel like for Afro descendants, if I'm being honest, this is definitely giving ceremonial. It's giving people are like recognizing the need for Afro descendants as a population that is at the crux of the climate crisis, with globally in every region across the whole land. When you look at where Black people are in their communities, in their environments, etc., there's a totem pole and they sit somewhere and it's at the bottom, and that's just not by accident. That's all in the uh, according to design. So yeah, we're fighting for this recognition. We're fighting for the ability to be able to advocate for ourselves. We're fighting for the ability to have the seat at the table. And if I'm being, again, honest, I don't think that we're going to leave this COP with it explicitly, but I do think that in pushing, in conversations, in negotiations, when you're all in those rooms, etc., just seeing if there can even be, curiosity about Afro descendants, about putting it in, about what it means, about what the definition is, about how we can integrate it into the text. I think that those are things that our community would really appreciate. So yeah, with that said, I can't tell you all anything concrete. Like I said, we're still looking to see if anything sticks, but we do know that it was in terms of women at the very least, in women and gender, it wasn't explicit. Let me see. I want to make sure that I'm yes, in 11 or 12, it's not Afro descendant explicitly, but women and girls of African descent or something like that. So it's like not the exact terminology that we want, but we're slowly but surely incrementing towards it being more acceptable, and more people being more open to Afro descendants being included in text. So yeah, that's kind of the update that I have.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. I really appreciate you being with us. And I know you're not alone in being tired and wondering if you're at your best for something like this. You did a terrific job of presenting your ideas. Thank you. We're all struggling to talk and articulate the best way we can under these conditions. So thank you for that. And I really appreciate your advocacy. And I will say also that this push towards the African descendant constituency, I think, is really powerful. And it did have a mark. All the advocacy work you did and others, I think, really did have an impact. It's not going to happen this time. But I think there was really good forward progress. And I really want to congratulate you for your hard work. And I know there was a document that went around. We signed it. I know other colleagues signed it, other organizations around this push for a unique constituency. And so it's begun. It's begun. And, so I think that is something to celebrate. And at the same time, I think it's also important to say, this is ridiculous. Why isn't it already there? And so let's also be real that this is all far behind. We're still dealing with colonial, racist, patriarchal constructs that are not even starting from ground zero, but are in the negative. So we also need to be real that we shouldn't have to be fighting for our human rights, our indigenous rights, for recognition of Afro-descendant peoples. I mean, it's also important to say out loud these systems of oppression that we're operating in and trying to elbow our way in and have these interventions. And I think sometimes people who are not deeply involved in these COP spaces, understandably, might not know that while we're here negotiating about ending the era of fossil fuels, how we're going to mitigate and work with adaptation and get funding for the climate crisis, we're also in these huge dialogues about humanity and what is real and what is safe and what is just and who's accountable. And all of these conversations are also going on, and they're part of this conversation as humanity is making its way through a very dark, dark time in history, let's face it. And so, yeah, it's a hard time. It's a very difficult, challenging time. So thank you very much for your incredible advocacy and work. And we're really glad you could be here, and we're here to support you. And with that, I would like to hand the floor over to Dr. Crystal Cavalier, who is Okanichi Band of the Saponi Nation. She's co-founder and CEO of 7 Directions of Service and chapter director of the 17 Rivers American Indian Movement. Welcome from Turtle Island, USA. So good to see you, Crystal.
Hey, it's good to see you too, Osprey. Mekudamin Chin Kyohei, Nahon Pipise, Mima Crystal. So I am so honored to be here. Good evening, relatives, sisters, and allies across the world. So just getting home from Belém on last Friday in the heart of the Amazon, it was a really beautiful trip. But whether we're there physically or joining through a screen, this moment calls all of us into this shared responsibility. When I was there on the ground, COP30 was supposed to be the year that the world turned towards Indigenous leadership. Brazil promised that these climate talks would be a beacon for our Indigenous relatives whose way of life is the rainforest, whose bodies and homelands carry the front lines of climate collapse. And even yet, in the Amazon, Indigenous voices are still being sidelined. Afro-descendant communities are being excluded. Women's voices are still being diluted. The Global South voices are being minimized. And this pattern isn't new. It is a legacy of international systems that treat Indigenous people as symbolic and not sovereign, as decorative and not decision-making. But here we are, we gather, and we still insist on being heard. Now, the reality, so I've had a lot of time to think about this on that flight home. The reality at COP30, while governments negotiate behind closed doors, what we're witnessing on the ground tells a different truth. Indigenous protesters, peaceful, organized, and unwavering, have had to disrupt the entry last week to the venue. One protester said that our actions were a scream over rights that were violated and decisions made without us. I want everyone listening to understand what that means. We should never have to scream to defend our existence. But this year's negotiations included climate finance, where the Loss and Damage Fund remains dramatically under-resourced, and many nations still refuse to pay their fair share. Nationally determined contributions, NDCs, must become fair, more ambitious, and also must integrate health, which is already failing in frontline communities. And then climate justice, centered here in the Amazon, a region whose people have historically sacrificed for profit. And then finally, health, as the climate-driven disease, heat, displacement, and pollution reshape the lives of millions. Now, it's already known that the absence of the U.S. federal government leadership, over 100 state and local leaders came anyway, proving that communities are stepping into the void left by national politics. But despite these significant developments, Indigenous people are still struggling for meaningful participation, not token representation, but genuine co-equal power in shaping the decisions that affect our lands, waters, and future generations. So let's be honest, it's not an accident when Indigenous people are excluded. It's not a scheduling, logistics, or capacity issue. It's a political choice, a choice driven by fear of what the world might become if an Indigenous leadership and stewardship, Indigenous laws, Indigenous governance truly shape this global climate policy. Because Indigenous people are not here to negotiate the terms of our extinction. Women and Indigenous women especially are leading despite every barrier. So this session, this gathering of global voices and women-led calls to action embodies the leadership the world needs right now. So women like Osprey, who I look up to, the water protectors, the seed keepers, the frontline mediators, Grandma Casey Camp, great-grandmother Mary Lyons, the cultural interpreters, the first to respond to the crisis, and the last to abandon hope. Indigenous women carry the memory of stolen children, broken treaties, burned homelands, and yet we're still here advocating for justice, restoration, and life. And at COP30, instead of elevating our leadership, the UN mechanisms still marginalized it. Panels were held without us, decisions were drafted without us, funds being allocated without our consent, but we raise our voices, and it is treated as a disruption rather than wisdom. I am staying tuned to see what comes out of the climate negotiations. But the truth is, there is no climate solution without our Indigenous women. There's no just transition. There's no path to healing that does not pass through the knowledge of those who have protected these lands for millennia. So what I really want to say is, I joined sisters from across continents to release these calls to action, honor Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, fully resource the Lost and Damaged Fund, integrate Indigenous-led rights of nature, land and rights into all climate plans, protect the Amazon and all sacred ecosystems, and then end the exclusion of Indigenous peoples at the UN. But also more than that, I want to talk about a call for just transition rooted in traditional ecological knowledge. If we're really serious about survival, and I mean truly serious, because it is getting to the point that it is getting hotter than ever. When we were there in the Amazon, I had read a study that the river dolphins were passing away because the waters were too hot. We really need a just transition that's just not optional. It's the only path forward. It means we are stopping sacrificing frontline communities for the comfort of those already protected by wealth and distance. It means we stop relying on extractive systems that destroy forests, poison the water, and bury our children under the weight of somebody else's profit. And at the heart of a just transition is the traditional ecological knowledge. Indigenous people have always practiced what the world now calls sustainability. We protected wetlands long before governments created environmental agencies. We preserve biodiversity through ceremony, reciprocity, and seasonality long before science caught up. And we understand the carbon cycles, food webs, and fire management, not as data points, but as relationships. And it was kind of scary just watching the fire that took place today earlier, not knowing that people made it out. So a just transition demands that we shift from extraction to regeneration, center Indigenous governance and land rights, protect water, forests, seeds, and the sacred. It's not about energy, it's about protecting systems that sustain life. And then elevate Indigenous women and fund Indigenous solutions at scale. So this is the blueprint for climate survival, and a lot of Indigenous people are talking about it. It's not a relic of the past. It is the blueprint for the future the world is desperate for. So I want to talk about in closing, because I don't know how many minutes I have, because like before I was just...
You're right there. You're right there. Boom.
We are continuing our ancestors. And I want to say this, the Amazon is not just a forest, it's a relative. It breathes for us, it feeds us, and it teaches us. The world calls the Amazon the lungs of the planet. The lungs cannot breathe if they're being cut down, and people cannot survive if their protectors are being silenced. So with that, I'm reminding the world that Indigenous women and women do not come to the climate negotiations asking for permission. We come carrying the future. So thank you so much, Mani Inese. Water is life. And thanks, Osprey.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I really appreciate you taking time to be with us. And I'm sure, you know, it's a lot to take in. So I'm glad that you're home safely, and we wish you well and love to work with you. And thank you for your work here and your words of wisdom. We really appreciate you. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Laura Cook, who is the Project Dandelion Senior Strategist, Climate Policy and Narrative Lead. Please go ahead, Laura. You have the floor.
Thank you, Osprey. And like others, I'm also feeling a bit tired and a bit exhausted here in Belém, so excuse me if I'm not as coherent as I would like to be. I've also changed a lot of the things I wanted to say today, and even in response to what I've been listening to, so I'm not going to say some of the things I'd planned. I'm also not a policy wonk, even though I love policy wonks. I'm not going to try and explain where negotiations are up to, because others have done that better than me and can do that better than me. But I did want to talk about the fire earlier today too. I have just found it a really humbling reminder that our shared humanity comes before any negotiation text or headline. And as others have already alluded to, this also reminds us of the fear and worry that exists around incidents like that, the same sort of fear and worry that exists in incidents all over the world, but times 100, times 1,000, times 1,000,000, because the crises impacting people through this planetary crisis that we're living in are crises where people do not always come out uninjured. They do not always come away with their lives. And as Ariel and others have said so well, they're not always accidents. These things are often very intentional and incredibly damaging. And I think the fire has been a reminder of that. But I also wanted to be really clear that we must not let this fire become the story of COP30 to me. Like, it cannot become the story of COP30. It must not become the story of COP30, because we mustn't talk about this COP as if it's over. It's not over yet. And moments like this can really unsettle us, but they can also remind us, I think, that we stand together. And some of us here are old enough to remember that when the Paris COP was going on 10 years ago, it was very much conducted under the shadow of tragedy. It's not only been 10 years since the Paris COP, it's also been 10 years since the Bataclan attacks and the other attacks that happened in Paris. 131 people killed, 90 of those in the Bataclan attack, and more injured across the city, and many, many more traumatized from those incidents. And at the same time, they held a COP, and they held a COP that came away with that multilateral agreement that we all gather around now and discuss. And to me, it's also a reminder that sometimes these incidents can actually change the course of a conversation in a COP. It was a reminder to come together in Paris with courage and solidarity and determination as human beings. And I may be a horribly hopeful optimist, but I do hope there's been a little bit of that with the fire here today. That there's been that reminder here in Belém of the same essential truth, that our shared humanity is what is at stake, and it's also what will carry us forward. If we go forward, it is what will carry us forward. And actually, these shared dramas, as I say, are happening all the time, and we need that shared humanity in our response to them. As many others on this call have so articulately said, women and Indigenous peoples and frontline communities, those who have frankly long been the moral centre of this crisis, they've already taught us what this resilience looks like. And it's not loud, it's not performative or tokenistic. It's this steady kind of resilience that resists and refuses fear or distraction or sensationalism. And I do actually think we have seen that here at the COP. There have been moments we have seen that here at the COP. I agree with all Maria said around the squeezing of civil society space, but I also hold in my heart the joyful moment that it was to march just a week ago, just, together with people, and also those immensely enjoyable moments of calm and spiritual reflection with Indigenous sisters and with faith leaders, both inside and outside of the COP. Women of faith have been incredible at this COP. We had a very special meeting with Project Dandelion in Casa Dorada, where the room was full to overflowing. The majority of the room were Indigenous and local people from Belém as well. We had empty chairs in the room that we kept empty at the time to remind us of those that could not be there, our past and our future ancestors, the rest of nature, those marginalized that we've been speaking about here today from the COP. And it was a really unwaveringly focused conversation. And I've seen that determination elsewhere in the COP, not always from our leaders, but certainly from civil society. And I just really hope that actually, because this COP is not over, negotiators will dig deep and find that in themselves as well, and that they will be supported by their countries to do so. And I wanted to name this, that the 2 weeks in Belém actually for me have also been marked by an extraordinary visibility and presence of women's leadership. Project Dandelion has been really proud to stand with women in this shoulder to shoulder throughout the COP. And I think in spite of the worries that women were going to be very underrepresented in terms of number, I don't think they've been underrepresented in terms of making themselves visible, and credit to all women who have just been really part of that action. I wanted to briefly highlight also the global ethical stocktake championed by Minister Silva. Actually, not particularly what's happening here in COP, but the hundreds of community dialogues, self-organized dialogues that happen in the months pre-COP in community, in circles, real dialogue, not panels, not speeches. And the words of one participant at one of the stocktakes I was involved in was Aisha Sadiqa, and those words have stayed with me throughout the COP and have come to mind today, which is that symbols and signals matter, political signals and symbols matter, but actually they only matter if they have a backbone, if they have a spine. And when we speak about a COP of truth, what we really mean is a COP that has a backbone, which is why I've also been super upset at the rolling back of language connected to the Gender Action Plan. Just as we need to speak specifically about Indigenous rights, we also need to speak about women's rights. And when we don't name it, it doesn't happen. We saw in the last summary of the national adaptation plans that more than 80% of those plans name women's vulnerabilities. Around 15% named women in solutions, named women as needing to be in decision-making rooms. A COP without a strong gender action plan or a rollback on that language is a COP that has failed to understand the reality of the fact gender is not a side issue. It's a structural truth of climate impacts, and it's what's needed in climate justice to really acknowledge that. I know we're really at time, Osprey, so I'm just going to say as well, this also means we need this full and fair and irreversible phase out of fossil fuels. Others have already said this. It means we also need adaptation. That's not just doubling, but tripling finance, but not just the money to reach the right people. And as Mary Robinson, one of our co-founders, often reminds us, that actually Article 29 of the Human Rights Declaration speaks not to us as individuals and our individual rights that we've spoken a bit about here today, but it also says everyone, I'm quoting, everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of our personality is possible. It's only through community and through working together that our rights as human beings will be fully realized. So I think we need more bridging within the negotiations, inside and out, more courage, great moral courage needed in the next 48 hours, more trust building, more willingness to move towards each other, but also beyond the COP today. And I think for those of us here, we need to remember not only that what we are negotiating here at COP is not abstract. I think everyone's spoken so clearly to that. It's about lives, dignity, security, the choices that will determine the future of our children and our children's children. But it's also about staying grounded and focused in this moment. And I would just really encourage others to hold the line. We need to hold the line firmly and compassionately and together. This is not the end of COP30. There is still possibility for change, and we must encourage our leaders to do that. And then beyond COP, there is much work to do on continuing to reform a system that still allows so many fossil fuel lobbyists in, a system with great cracks and great weaknesses in, but a system that for the next few hours is the one we need to try and uphold for the best possible outcome we can strive for, so that this is not a COP about a fire, it's a COP about what happened after the fire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your good words and inspiration and insights. I'm really glad that you're here and your team at COP30. Thank you so much for all your contributions. We really appreciate it. And, you know, one thing that I was really touched by, which was throughout the hallways over the last week and a half, and I think still will be as we resume probably the negotiations this evening and tomorrow, is the call to keep 1.5 alive. I think it's critical, and one of the most powerful speakers that I heard this week talking about that is the minister from Vanuatu, who gave a very powerful speech that we have recorded, and anyone can look at our social media. It moved us enough to actually make a singular post on it, because, you know, 1.5 degrees is what was legally decided upon at Paris Climate Agreement. We can't just having corporations and governments just saying, well, you know, we can't maintain 1.5. It's no longer possible. That is a legally agreed to number. That is what is currently in the Paris Climate Agreement. I'm certainly not prepared, and I know many colleagues are not prepared. Certainly, frontline communities and you know, island nations are not prepared to just roll over and say business as usual. We have to keep drilling for more fossil fuels. We can't do this quick enough, because we are creating our future. We're the ones deciding it. And if all governments really put their political will and their finance and their energy and their policies behind keeping a 1.5 degree guardrail, making the just transition, keeping human rights and indigenous rights and women's rights at the center of our negotiations, lifting up rights of nature, we would be able to get to where we need to go. So we must not give up, because if we give up, then we're really giving into these greed and to these old regimes that are very much rising in authoritarianism. We're giving into capitalism. We're giving into the, let's say, techno-billionaires and all those who are bringing a great deal of harm to the earth right now. So I just wanted to also mention that I heard some very powerful interventions by ministers talking about keeping 1.5 alive. And I think that's something that will continue into this evening and as the negotiations go on over the next few days. We have one final speaker, someone very special to WECAN. Catherine Quaid is from the Umatilla Nation in the United States, and she is our communications director. And I've been so honored to be with her on the ground here at COP30, and we wanted to give the final word to her. Catherine, you have the floor. Thank you.
Everyone, Catherine, also a little raspy, also a little tired, as many of our other colleagues we've been running around the negotiation rooms with. And it's been really wonderful to hear from everybody, to hear different parts of the negotiations. As you can hear, there's a lot of different tracks to follow. There's a lot of focus areas here. And so I hope you all got, you know, a really good, at least understanding of some of those really key points that we're following and that we're organizing around. And I really just wanted to speak to some of the collective power of our movements in these spaces. I think, especially here in Brazil, we're kind of seeing that at all levels. Specifically, I help track and follow and participate in the negotiations around the Just Transition Work Program. We heard a lot about the Belém Action Mechanism, but another aspect that is being negotiated here is what they're sort of calling just transition principles, which are coming out after 2 years of dialogues within the Just Transition Work Program, which has been set in a dialogue system, which is why we're trying to move it into an implementation mechanism. But I think there are some really critical wins there that we're looking for in these final texts due to the collective cross-constituency organizing by climate justice movements, by, you know, social movements, indigenous communities, in alignment with parties who agree with us. I think there's a few things I just wanted to name briefly. Is one, that we have care workers and informal work included in that draft text at this point. We also have earlier in a draft text, there were mentions of FPIC as well as Indigenous rights. And there was also mentions on quote unquote social and environmental risks of so-called transition or critical minerals. And I think those really are a telling point of how our communities are advocating in these spaces. Because when we have that language included, that means that we can advocate for those moving forward. Like I said, we don't have the final text yet. We'll see, what's included, what's excluded, but I also know that our communities will continue to fight for those pieces, just as we are in the Gender Action Plan and fighting against these rollbacks on gender just language across the negotiations. I think another piece that I really want to name is, a lot of our partners wanted us to be here in Brazil. We've talked about it a little bit. And I think a really amazing part of it has been seeing, thousands of people from social justice movements, climate movements, indigenous communities, frontline communities come here and share their analysis and talk with each other and build that global solidarity that we need in this moment of the climate crisis. We're talking about 1.5, keeping it alive, and we're here in Brazil feeling the impacts of the climate crisis every day. We're seeing torrential rain that they've shared is unusual, is fueled by a climate crisis. We're experiencing really intense heat and humidity. We're seeing how the infrastructure is not necessarily prepared for this. And so we are here experiencing this just as they asked us to, just to see the heart of Brazil, the heart of the Amazon, but also to experience what does this climate crisis look like here. And I think that's a very important takeaway that we should all be holding if you're in Brazil, but also not, and really considering how are we all going to move forward with this. And there were really amazing civil society spaces, Cúpula dos Povos, which translates to People Summit outside of the venue, and a lot of other great spaces where they're starting to bridge these connections and build these connections with the people and collectively. And I think that is just, again, something that we haven't been able to do for a few COPs. This is my 6th COP, and the last few COPs, we haven't had that civil society engagement or participation. And we've seen how even these indigenous people's actions are pushing the dial inside of the UNFCCC space. And so I think, this is a very important aspect of how we can continue moving forward as civil society, as social movements, and really being the heartbeat in these climate conference spaces to push forward the parties who do align with us, to encourage them, to ask them to go further, and to really fight for what we know we deserve and need as communities all around the world experiencing the climate crisis, and for future generations, and for all the ecosystems and biomes that we love. And so I know that for me, it's actually very moving to be here with our partners and to share those stories. And as we've kind of talked about, the negotiations are happening, and there's so much more going on within and beyond that we're going to carry forward into next year, into our relationships with each other, into our programs, into our collective communities, but also into COP31. So, we continue to become more organized, we continue to push for our rights, and we're going to continue to hold these governments accountable. So those are just a few things I wanted to share, Osprey. And just, the power is with the people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. It's been such an honor to be here with you. And we've been running up and down the halls and sweating together and doing the things. I wanted to close our wonderful session here, which for those of us in our audience who know, we've sort of started this tradition of, at the end of the negotiations, right before they're over, to meet sort of spontaneously with women leaders on the ground to lift up women's leadership, to really demonstrate the incredible impact women leaders are having in these COPs, from the grassroots to the highest levels of government. And one of the things that has been really exciting, as I say, I want to close out with, is that we have met with our partners, specifically here in Ecuador and Brazil, who have come to the COP around our Women for Forest program. And you can go online, and we have lots of different resources online about our Women for Forest program. And it's just been really, really moving to have time to meet with them and to further explore our work around our programming with Women for Forests. And I think significantly in terms of policy, one of the things that has been very strong for us that we're really connecting with different leaders about and hoping to push forward is that there's a lot of what we call false approaches or false solutions to how to care for forests and how to actually regenerate damaged forests, whether it's through fire or agribusiness or illegal logging or mining. And so many market mechanisms are out there that really further the capitalistic framework and create more debt for the global south and where a lot of these forests are. And we'll be coming out with a statement about this tomorrow and also putting out a full report early in the new year on this topic. These struggles around RED programs and many of these issues some of you might be familiar with has been ongoing, which is really a commodification and financialization of nature. And it's a way basically for people to make money off of pollution or to make money off of forests instead of actually investing in forests, regenerating forests, stopping the harm to forests, and especially lifting up the indigenous communities and local communities that are tending to these forests. And we're designing and have been working with many others to create a way to bring things much closer to the ground by generating these Women for Forest projects on the ground where women are directly funded to care for their forests. We do trainings, we do advocacy, and the gazillions of dollars that are going around on these bureaucratic programs that often really benefit corporations and governments and banks and not actually the people in the forests. We are saying we have a different model for this. So I wanted to show everyone as our final part of our programming tonight, a new video that we've just come out with that we released during COP30. And if we could go ahead and play that now, and then I have a few closing comments after we see the video. It's very short and we're really excited to share it with everyone. Thank you. If you could go ahead and share the video now. Thank you. Deep in the Ecuadorian Amazon rainforest, indigenous women of the Seriaco community are taking action to protect their territories and communities, one seed at a time.
Yo pienso que es algo que es único, un trabajo con mujeres, reforestando, regenerando, organizándose, generando también recursos a través de eso, proponiendo nuevas alternativas, recuperando todo lo que está perdiéndose.
WECAN has been honored to be working in partnership with Indigenous women leaders in the Sadiak community for many years, which has led to this thriving forest protection and reforestation project.
This project is helping to protect and restore over 135,000 hectares of rainforest in the Amazon.
We know that healthy global forests are absolutely vital to mitigating the worst impacts of both the climate and biodiversity crises, and the Amazon rainforest is critical in this global effort, as are the indigenous women of the Amazon.
The Amazon rainforest is the most biodiverse ecosystem and largest forest on Earth. Yet, the Amazon is at a critical tipping point and faces severe threats of mining, extraction, and industrial expansion, driving rapid deforestation, biodiversity extinction, and the climate crisis. Indigenous women are successfully reforesting and protecting forests, guided by the Sadiaco initiative of Kausak Sacha, the Living Forest Declaration.
Kausak Sacha es la búsqueda de un reconocimiento de que la naturaleza, la selva, es un ser vivo consciente y por lo tanto sujeto de derechos.
Las mujeres están muy emocionadas porque son las que realmente cultivan la tierra. También les permite estar muy activas y ser reconocidas como guardianas de esta reforestación, de estas selvas, y es un trabajo en las que estamos muy emocionadas.
La mujer indígena se conecta con la naturaleza a base de prácticas tradicionales que nosotros tenemos. La mujer indígena desde hace mucho tiempo ha venido correlacionándose con la tierra, con el aire, con la selva mismo. Es una conexión muy profunda que nosotros tenemos, ya que todo lo que nos rodea es energético y nos conserva. Nosotros dependemos de ella y ella depende de nosotros.
We host trainings on women's leadership, reforestation, advocacy, and land defense to support a healthy forest. Women participants travel deep into the jungle to gather over 100 species of native trees that are in danger of going extinct. These trees are central to Amazonian ecological integrity, waterways, and culture of the Sariaco community.
Y manteniendo nuestras prácticas tradicionales de seguir reforestando árboles y plantas que están ya en peligro de extinción en otros pueblos, para de esta manera conservar el territorio libre y sano de otras actividades extractivas.
Las mujeres de Sarayaku se encuentran muy contentas porque se sienten que están aportando directamente a la conservación. Como mujeres y madres también están compartiendo el conocimiento con sus hijos.
This project also includes advocacy at international forums, where the forest solutions and expertise of Sariaco women leaders are amplified on the global stage. As governments and corporations continue to advocate for fall solutions that commodify nature, such as carbon credits, carbon offsets, and biodiversity credits, this project is offering a successful, scalable strategy outside of these market-based mechanisms. This work is generated at the grassroots level and protects and restores forests damaged by colonization and extractive industries, and tackles the core drivers of the climate and biodiversity crises.
La reforestación con WECAN y con el enfoque femenino nos permite hacer que esa fortaleza que tienen las mujeres se plasme en una reforestación diferente, que esté absolutamente acorde a los principios de los pueblos indígenas y a la visión de la selva viviente.
So we wanted to share that very positive note with you as we close out our evening, that while all of these negotiations are going on, one thing that we really love at WECAN is all of our programs, whether it's reforestation programs, forest protection programs, doing food security work. There's many spaces we operate in, not just at the COP, and to see women's leadership really leading the way in so many different arenas. This is what we believe in, the people's movements, the work that's going on the ground, and that's what is really going to carry us forward as we work collectively to move through this very serious crisis that is really what many scholars call a polycrisis, that is economic, social, and environmental. This is a turning point for humanity. Let's face it, it is nothing smaller than that, and it's going to require all of us to be thinking in different ways and invite new ways of thinking, and really looking both not just externally, but internally. There's a huge transformation going on, and COP is one of the spaces where a lot of these intensity points come together. In closing, I want to say that I just looked at the update. We've not heard any news yet from the COP presidency. We're supposed to be hearing that at the top of the hour. Right now, it is 7:21 in the evening in Belém, Brazil. We should be hearing about at 8 o'clock tonight what is going to happen since the fire occurred inside the blue zone today. And the most important thing is that the people who were harmed are taken care of, that the problem is resolved, which I hear they're speedily doing, that people are cared for emotionally as well from the incident, and that we can resume the negotiations because they're at a critical point and we need to really finish this in a powerful way and push as hard as we can for the results that we want. I'm very thankful that Catherine Quaid is with me on the ground. You just heard from her. I also want to thank Sofia Lovato and Ashley Bodardo from the WECAN staff. They're here on the ground also with us at COP30 and have been helping us organize outside of the COP space with all the other arenas and spaces and event arenas that have also been really powerful here at COP30. And I also want to thank Gillian Lyons, Jacqueline Duncan, Livia Charles, and Allison Fabrizio. They are also on our WECAN team and have been there to do communications work, doing research. There's also ways you can remotely participate in the negotiations. So we've been also involved in negotiating spaces virtually. We've also written a tremendous amount of reports, as I've been sharing with you throughout this broadcast, with our research team and writing team. So we have put everything on the line for COP30. We're here 100% for the transformation that we know we deserve and that the people deserve and that our Earth deserves. And we're so honored to share this with our audience today and into this evening. And we will continue on in the negotiations. My guess is they will definitely run into Saturday, given what happened today. And we look forward to being in touch with you as we go forward. Please join our newsletter. Please participate with us on our social media platforms. And we send our best and our love and our care to all of you. Thank you so much.